on the other one, you bastard!
Iron Factory has come a long way since beginning the third-party Legends trend, and along the journey there's been a lot of changes to their design philosophy. Personally, I feel that they've hit their stride since the advent of War Giant. Since this beast of a figure, we've gotten winner after winner after winner. However, with the advent of IDW's cancellation and reboots, and also with the emergence of Magic Square and New Age, there has been a difference in design philosophy going forward. Does that make sense grammatically? I don't know if it makes sense grammatically. But this is by no means a bad thing. I'm very excited for what the future holds, especially with their samurai designs. Those look pretty neat. But before we truly dive into this new era of Iron Factory, I thought it would be important to shine a light on one of their hidden gems within the current generation, and see how that relates to everything going forward. Greetings Cybertronians, I'm DrLockdown, and today's diagnosis pertains to Iron Factory EX-38 Optics Hunter, also known to you and I as Hound. Now, funnily enough, as far as I can remember, Hound never had a consistent and widely popular design within the greater IDW continuity. I haven't read that much of IDW, but from my limited knowledge, he isn't one of the main players. As such, this figure comes from Iron Factory's decision to capitalize on fan-favorite G1 characters, just done in a sort of IDW-esque original aesthetic, which is actually a precursor to what they're producing on the horizon. And what's better way to give this a shot than to hark back to a classic staple of third party, and I mean classic in the oldest sense. Let the transformation influence the alt mode design philosophy. As such, in vehicle mode, many have complained that he looks almost too third-party, but personally I think this really works in his favour. To describe it in the most accurate terms, it's very similar to an old Fans Project vehicle mode, except 3 times as cohesive and, from my limited Fans Project experience, 3 times better built. It really surprises me that they're able to do a vehicle mode in a style not really seen these days, and yet actually build upon it in terms of modern engineering. Given the immense shift towards accuracy and smoother vehicle modes, this is a very nice change of pace. And even on its own merits, it's done remarkably well. Despite cramming in a very high parts count, the way it's designed makes the seam lines almost disappear entirely. The green plastic for the most part is just plain plastic with no finish, but on first glance it almost seems like it's got a gorgeous matte finish, and all over are incredibly well done paint applications. I know I'm a bit of a broken record saying that yellow paint is rarely done well, but in this instance it is, and I do apologise that my scheduling has caused such a repetition. But again, they've done it immensely well, especially at the size. Granted, some of the parts are for robot mode, like the lights on the roof and the yellow stripes on the side, but then there's also the front section, which probably would have been left empty if left to a company like DX9 or Magic Square. In fact, I think there is another third-party Hound from Mech Fans Toys that does look that bland. Then you've got the mean silver and gunmetal combo, which accentuates the incredibly tough demeanor that the bumper exudes. Can car bumpers exude demeanors? Regardless, they even went and painted the window wipers. The back section hasn't been left out either, with extra gunmetal that gets hidden in robot mode and 4 red tail lights, which themselves are also bordered by extra gunmetal. Not the most paint on the planet, but there is a lot and it's all done very well. Well, except for the star. It's a smidge messy. But at this size, I think it's fair to cut it some slack. I think one of my favourite elements of this design is the unique way it flows. The way it's done makes it seem to have a much wider lower section than top section, making it almost seem partially seaworthy. I'm not sure if this is intentional, but it is doing things for me. And yeah, given the engineering, it might seem weird that a design like this has any flow to it at all, but that's just how well they've integrated the conversion. There are very few elements that feel jarring in the end. Even the seating section is passable at the very least, aided by the pristine silver paint applications. If there was one section I feel they cheaped out just a little bit, it would have to be the top of the back. I can cut it a little bit of slack considering the way he transforms, but some extra tooling would have been greatly appreciated. Also, the weapon storage is a little weak. Quickly going over accessories, you get a missile and a rifle. The former, although not the most solid fit, works well enough for the size and even has its own hinge for unnecessary at this scale, but definitely appreciated articulation. But the rifle looks pretty silly. It's the only element of the vehicle mode that I feel isn't justified, but not because it's awful in its own right. It's fine, but honestly the rest of the vehicle mode is done so well that it makes this feel far worse than it actually is. Although maybe that's just my own bias talking, considering the weapon storage on the last 2 figures I reviewed. You do have to consider how bloody tiny this thing is, and whilst Iron Factory has definitely done weapon storage far better, it's not really fair to get too harsh on a toy that's basically the size of a Hasbro Legends release. Is it the best vehicle mode the company has ever put out? No, but it does look pretty good rolling out with other figures from the series. Which, oh, by the way, it does so incredibly well thanks to the addition of pinned wheels. Very much appreciated, and ultimately that's what this vehicle mode exudes, a very much appreciated underappreciated energy, if that makes any sense. They've included a lot of little nuances that hark back to a simpler time in third party, whilst still delivering a modern execution. Besides, if we're talking about why I think this is one of the best modern Iron Factory figures, one mode really isn't enough to cover it. It's all about what takes place in between. On paper, this might seem like a pretty simple and stock standard transformation, but in practice, this is actually one of the most effortless Legends transformations I have come across. To me, this feels more indicative of New Age's designs than it does Iron Factory's. Not saying Iron Factory has ever had bad engineering, because it usually doesn't, but this feels like a level that's a bit above what they're used to. Now, the first thing you want to do is come under here and undo the panels, because that will allow you to do the legs and all that jazz later on. And then you bring out these panels here as well, just because it makes it a bit easier. Then you split it at the seat section and start the feet back up there, and they fold into the feet like so. And surprisingly, you need to actually disengage the legs first, or disconnect them before you actually rotate them outwards. It doesn't really work before you do that, it's weird. But then you can collapse the panels from earlier, then you take the feet and you use this double hinge to move it into place, and also rotate the toe section around 180 degrees to make the foot, and then to complete the look you get this panel down. Then we can kind of start work by disengaging the shoulders, and sort of disengaging the lower arms from both there, and these panels up here. Then you bring the shoulders out on these hinges, and rotate these shoulder pads forward. You then open up this section, and open up this panel here, and that'll allow you to move this whole section down. You've actually got 2 bits here, and 2 slots here, and the entire torso section slots together. You then push the panel in, and then the head actually pegs into the top part of the panel as well. You then just want to make sure this is fully rotated up, because then you just want to collapse this all the way in, and then that'll allow you to move that up, move that down, move that over that. It's complicated, but it does get everything lined up properly. And of course you can adjust these side panels to your liking. Finally, rotate the head 180 degrees on the ball joint. So yeah, this transformation is damn interesting. There's a lot of crazy parts that go on with this thing, but it never feels overbearing. It feels very purposeful. It feels very professional. It feels more like a New Age figure than it does an Iron Factory figure, and I mean that as the highest compliment. Now in robot mode, Hound is pretty decent. As stated earlier, Hound's representation in IDW has been pretty minimal compared to the big leagues such as Chrome Dome, Cyclonus, and Spinister, all characters who hypothetically should have been background nobodies, but hey, that's the beauty of IDW. As such, what they've decided to do here is basically take Hound and put him through an Iron Factory filter. This isn't to be confused with an IDW filter, because although it's close to the IDW aesthetic, it's clear that this was designed as an original idea with an emphasis on quick conversion. The transformation drives both modes in design, and as something that fits into that category, it does so quite well. First off, the proportions work surprisingly effectively. Often with designs like these, the proportions are the first thing to be sacrificed, and the results can vary from slightly weird to downright awful. In this instance though, the only real thing I can fault is the arms being a smidge bigger than one would expect, but it's such a minor thing and at such a small size it's barely noticeable. The roller mode is also surprisingly clean. I mean, sure, Hound is typically a rather bulky fellow, so it's not the hardest to minimize kibble, but considering the transformation he goes to, I do find this commendable. Yes, from the back it's not the cleanest, with some rather hollow shoulders and exposed hinges on the Magma Forest area. Damn, I want to play more Xenoblade. But for the most part, it's a fully realized robot mode with minimal sacrifices. I really do love the bulk they've put into the legs, which is surprising considering how many moving parts they have. I guess having a large focus on the traditional unfold the damn thing means they've got a solid base to work from, and as such, the aesthetic is very deliberate. In fact, the only element that I find is truly underdone to the point where I can actually consider it a valid criticism is the head. I do like the somewhat exaggerated helmet design, but the face sculpt itself is a little bland. The eyes get lost in the lackluster sculpting, and the mouth completes the dull surprise checklist. I suppose I can cut it some slack given the size, but considering most of the recent Iron Factory figures have excelled in this department, it does feel like a little bit of an oversight. Although there is another recent figure that does an even worse head sculpt, but believe me, I'll be getting to that soon enough. Now, typically an ugly head sculpt can massively reduce the overall score of a figure, but in this case with such a tiny package and such an emphasis on the positives, I do feel some leeway is necessary, even if it doesn't hold up to the standard set forth by the company in releases prior. The sculpt work, in tandem with the articulation, easily makes this expressive enough despite this fact. As for the accessory count, it's not overblown, but it is far from modest. The rocket pod is sculpted remarkably well and receives a pristine silver paint job, so it strikes a nice balance of standing out without overdoing it on the paint apps. Due to sculpting, it sadly only fits on one shoulder. It might seem like it could potentially fit on the other, but there's sadly tiny nubs to prevent it. It's a bit confusing, but the functionality you do get is quite awesome. I'd go as far as saying that it looks incomplete without it. It also retains its hinge on top of an extra slight waggle left over from transformation, so there are posing options, albeit few in number. His gun is serviceable, which is actually kind of weird considering it was just pulled out of the designer's ass. It doesn't line up with any IDW artwork I've seen, and it certainly doesn't match up with G1, which, by the way, thank for that, since it looks incredibly stupid. I feel they could have done this way better, but it's not terrible. His hands are simple 5mm pegs, which continue to work effortlessly at this tiny scale. I love how Iron Factory have wholeheartedly embraced this cross-compatibility with Hasbro, because it opens up a bunch of options. Finally, similarly to the previously reviewed Megatron, you get 4 extra hands, 2 in closed fists form and 2 in open palm form. I feel these are done much better in comparison to the aforementioned Megatron thanks to the use of 5mm pegs, which, by the way, opens up the possibilities for even more wacky appendages. This also means these holes are coincidentally Siege Blast Effects compatible, so I suppose you can fill your Jeeper Creeper quota if you like GoBots that much. I feel the real element that ties all of this together, though, is the expertly done articulation. For a little fella, this guy is really posable. The head is on a ball joint with plenty of range in all directions. The shoulders are also on ball joints, and thankfully the shoulder kibble doesn't get in the way, provided you don't have the missile attached. The biceps swivel with no issues, and the elbows get you a solid 90. His wrists, by virtue of being 5mm pegs, also swivel, as does the waist. And above said waist, you also get an ab crunch. I always give credit to figures who put the ab crunch above the waist swivel, as if it's below it ends up becoming rather useless. It's a very nice touch. The ball jointed hips work in every which way you could ask for, and the thighs swivel unhampered. The knees get you a solid 90, but you can open up the panels at the back to get even more rotation. Finally, the feet are incredibly well done, with not just an ankle tilt, but also a foot pivot that works all the way forwards as well as a little bit of the way back. For a Legends figure, this is really at the top of its game in terms of articulation, and when you consider the sizes packed into, these elements really shine. And ultimately, it's the way the figure is engineered that makes this truly one of the best in the line. Sure, the robot mode is quite good, but it's not one of the best Iron Factory have done. And yes, the vehicle mode is lush, but that's not usually what makes you love a figure. Not saying you can't love a figure for its vehicle mode, but it's not that common, and typically you need more to truly give it that push over the edge. In this case, it's the hardware. The transformation and articulation are truly at the top of their class, especially by Iron Factory standards. Aesthetics can usually only get you so far, and if Iron Factory switches entirely to figures like these, then maybe, just maybe, they'll be able to take back the top spot from their competitor, New Age. I don't think I need to elaborate why I've given this figure the final score that I have given it. It's pretty obvious. All that remains to be said is, where to from here? Well, in my eyes, the engineering style and the overall design acts as a precursor for what Iron Factory intends to do going forward. With the 2005 continuity of IDW truly winding down, a change is needed in their business strategy, and this is the way to do it. You can already see this design philosophy take root in upcoming figures, such as Powerglide and Scourge, and yeah, I have seen plenty of complaints that they are too third-party because they don't follow the IDW aesthetic, but if those two figures are as well engineered as Hound here, then we are in for an absolute treat. So ultimately, Hound isn't just the best engineered figure that Iron Factory has put out, but he's also the perfect foundation of what Iron Factory intends to do in the future. But I suppose that covers the higher end of the spectrum for Iron Factory, but what happens if we go in the other direction? Well, typically I don't give previews for the next episode, but this time I feel I'm confident enough that I'll actually deliver that on time. So I guess, see you next time.